Hello.
Good evening, everyone from Mumbai, India, and good day, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us once again for our Inclusive Cities series, which we are doing with the Stanford Center for Democracy, Development and the Rule of Law. My name is Elsa Marie De Silva. I'm the founder and CEO of Red Dot Foundation. And my co-host for today and always for this series is Pratima Manohar.
Thank you, Elsa, and welcome to the Inclusive Cities livecast. You know, the COVID-19 pandemic has significantly altered urban life. Our streets, parks, public spaces are empty. Metros and buses are not even functioning in most parts of India and rest of the world. Work from home is the new normal, if you can work from home. And all the things that make cities fun also make them very vulnerable to pandemics like coronavirus. Things that we love about the city, like the buzz, the interaction, social life, the vibrancy, have had to be sacrificed to fight this virus. Today, we will reflect on the future of urban life with George Ferguson, who's an old friend, and he is a politician, an architect, and an entrepreneur. So he has the great vantage point of talking us through the future of urban life. He was the former mayor of Bristol in UK. He was the past president of Royal Institute of British Architects and the founding director of the Academy of Urbanism. George, thank you so much for joining us from Bristol. How are you doing today?
It's a pleasure. I'm doing fine. I mean, there is a disaster around us, and I'm a theatre proprietor, and I have restaurants and bars and a brewery, so all that is difficult. But can you see me now?
Yes, you can.
Okay.
We can see.
Something went wrong then. But personally, I'm happy in my isolation. I'm getting exercise. The weather is not too bad. It's a bit cold. And it's given me time to think about cities. And I think given me time to think about the opportunities that come out of a crisis. And that is a really important thing. We have to grasp the opportunities when you have a crisis.
George, that's my first question. We are potentially going to have to live with this virus for substantial amounts of time. We don't really know when the therapy that will be effective or a vaccine will come about. So, as countries and cities all over the world look at an exit strategy, it's a good time to discuss the implication of this pandemic on urban life and how should cities be adapting to living with this virus as we think about opening up and going back to some sense of normalcy.
Yes, I mean, I don't like to talk about going back, but I think we have made some huge mistakes in the development of our cities. I think high density brings some very good things with it. High density brings activity, vibrancy, walkability, and all those things that make a city a good place to live in. But when that gets excessive, as it does in many cities, then it becomes a real difficulty in terms of quality of life. And it has got artificially excessive for instance, in the Chinese cities where they have built these domino blocks marching into the distance and filled them with people from the countryside that don't really want to be there but have to be there. So I think there are huge amounts of change that could come out of this in thinking about how we give better living and working conditions for people. And on the other hand, in America, you have sprawl cities. People's desire is to have a house and garden. And I totally understand that. It's a great desire. But when that leads to the sort of sprawl that makes us all car dependent, it gives no quality of space or life or vibrancy. And so I think that those two extremes we now need to look at and find answers for. And I think those two extremes have created monocultures too. They're a sprawl monoculture of just suburban living, and this high density monoculture with very few facilities for people living in what I describe as vertical cruise ships. And no wonder the virus spreads in places like that, where you have a lot of buttons for the elevators, you have lots of door handles that you're sharing with hundreds of people. So I think there are a lot of things that could help us now review those two extremes.
George, I live in one of those cities which has many of those vertical cruise ships, and and we are in a complete lockdown mode where we can't even for exercise step outside, only for essential grocery shopping. And we've tried to discuss this urban density and what does it mean, and what about the cities of the future, because take India, for example. Most of our cities have populations of countries, and it's only going to get more dense. They say by 2050, 70% of the world's population will live in urban areas and cities. And so you're going to, have to deal with the fact that these cities are going to be extremely dense in places where the population is so high, like in India. So what is your view on density, and especially in cities going forward like ours?
Yeah, well, I've welcomed density in principle up to a point, and there are some great European cities with very high densities, like Barcelona and Paris, and some of the Italian cities. They've got high density. Their high density is developed generally around streets and blocks of no more than probably 6 stories high, 6 or 7 stories high. Walkable, so you are able to walk up if you're fit. There is an elevator if you're not, and on the ground floor there tends to be more public facilities and retail and leisure facilities and things like that. And Berlin is a very good example of that as well. And the densities are pretty high, and I think they're high enough to make sure that you always have facilities within your walking distance. And it's almost crazy to own a car in those cities. It's crazy to own a car in New York. New York is not really high density because of the high buildings. New York's high density because of its street pattern, and the majority of buildings around those streets are not the skyscrapers. The skyscrapers stick out above. And many of those skyscrapers, as we know, are big commercial buildings in any case. So I'm a great advocate of high density. I'm increasingly very wary of high buildings. High buildings, I think, with probably a single entrance, don't create any life to the ground. They don't create communal life in a way that a street does with many doorways, a street does with many shop windows, or whatever it may be. So excessive high density, I am very wary about. But I think we need to look more fundamentally at the definition of the city. The city in ancient times, and I said I don't really want to talk about going back, but I think we learn from history. The city in ancient times was completely self-sustaining in that the city was much more than just the urban area. It was the city and the countryside around, and from that countryside around, you grew your food, you had small farms, generally small holdings, and they would feed the city. Now, the cities have become so big that that's become impractical, but the contrast now is that most of the land around our cities is either used for recreation or other uses other than growing, or where it is used for growing, it is growing cash crops and other crops that are taken away from the city rather than are contributing to the city. So my ideal city is one that does still have high density, but that the fingers of the country come into the city. So you have, the countryside seeping into the city, and the city to a certain extent going out to the country, but not as a block. And we're very lucky in the UK because in 1947, a pretty critical date in terms of India, we had the Town and Country Planning Act. And the Town and Country Planning Act created the green belt around our cities, and that has largely still stayed, although it has been broken. And so we do still have a quite strong relationship between the urban and the rural, but physical relationship, but the social and working relationship has broken down. And I think another thing that can come out of this crisis, because we are changing the way we're working at the moment, and I'm working from my home, you're working from your homes, and I think less of us will go to our offices every day. And I think employers, and I'm an employer and I have 250 people on furlough at the moment, or over 200 people in my various interests, are thinking, many of them are thinking creatively, why do we bring everybody into the office every day? Maybe we could have 2 days in the office, 2 days at home, and 1 day doing something else, working on the farm. And so I've put some people on, I have a small farm as well. So we've put some of the people who were working in our bar on the farm, and they're loving it. So I think it is an opportunity for people to think a bit differently about that relationship between city and rural, between urban and rural, because we do need connection with nature, and do that sometimes cheaper to buy food that's traveled thousands of miles than it is to buy food from your local fields, because they've been basically taken over by the big corporations.
You make a great point about the distinction between high-rise, high-density, and crowding. Now, density has been at the heart of the big debate around COVID, as you know. It's usually the first fall guy. The cities become centers of any major crisis, maybe because they're the kind of foundations of the world economy, and maybe pandemics have more links to trade than density. But as you're seeing that, around the world, there's been a huge debate about, density in general. And, my question to you is, as governments push, to manage this crisis, we've had to do things like lockdowns and social distancing. And you've been to my city. We've actually hung out a fair bit in the city of Mumbai. It's one of the densest places in the world, and it's more dense in the in low rise than in high rise. But it is very crowded. The urban poor in my city have been most burdened by the rules to fight COVID. In a way, it's impossible for them to follow the rules, that require us to fight this crisis. I remember, I think we even walked in some of the slum communities in the city, and we have these narrow bylanes, through which they have to go into their homes, which are tiny, where 8 or 10 people are sleeping at any given time. So it's hyper density, and a lot of the community that lives there cannot really work from home because their livelihood is in the streets of our city. A lot of them, as you know, don't have access to drinking water, let alone water to wash their hands. So urban inequality is, in essence, is the biggest hazard when a crisis like this hits us. So, and you've been a huge advocate of socially inclusive neighborhoods, and you've also been somebody who's from you worked in the private sector, and today in cities around the world, we have private sector, in essence, delivering our built environment. Large parts of our built environment is being delivered by the private sector. So how can, learning from this crisis, how can we enable more inclusive, diverse communities in our city that have to be in a way delivered by private sector? What kind of rules should we have? This has been a big lesson for all of us around the world, whether you're in New York, whether you're in London, or you're in Mumbai. Urban inequality is the biggest threat to resilience.
Absolutely. And resilience is the key word. I think resilience is such a good guiding principle for the deliverance of good cities. And also strong city government, which I don't think India generally has. I think strong mayors can make a huge difference. We don't have a strong mayor system in the UK, but so you have to do things by persuasion. But where there is a strong mayor leading a city, they can face up to central government, to federal government. And that is happening in the States, where there is a rather eccentric president, and the mayors, I think, are taking a great lead. So I think it's the mayors that are creating more environmentally and socially integrated places, or beginning to lead to that. I don't want to dwell too much on the whole COVID-19 thing, but you're right that it's the poor that are suffering worse. It's the poor that are suffering worse in the UK as well, and it's many of the poor who are living in these high blocks in places like Glasgow, which has the highest rate of coronavirus infection in Scotland, where they think that that form of living is contributing to it. You're right. I walked through some of the slums in Mumbai, and I tell you, I think there's some great social aspects to those areas. I know there's extreme poverty, but I see a greater sense of community there than you see in the richer areas. And it's how do you grasp that great sense of community, of people looking out for each other, of children playing in the street. Now, you can't have children playing in the street in the rich areas because people are driving their big cars and making it too dangerous for people to do so. And streets should belong to the people much more than they do to the cars. And so I think there are lessons to be learned, but it's just too hugger-mugger in the slum areas. But when you rebuild, as one must do for the populations of those areas, just stuffing them into these great big vertical buildings that take away all the social aspect, the good social aspect of living together, is not the answer. And I think there are some Indian architects, for instance, who have found some really good answers, who have observed what happens socially in those areas and have taken those while giving people a much better opportunity for not only having better homes, but to develop those homes incrementally, socially, to build upwards when they are able to, but to 3 or 4 stories, not to, not into the sky, which is maybe okay for rich people. I've got billionaire friends with apartments in New York. Okay, it's okay for them to be up in the sky. But if you are living in poverty, you're imprisoned by it. And I think that that is where we have to get the balance right.
In Mumbai, we've seen, the old architecture for low-income housing had this community areas in the chawl system. And when they upgraded, they lost out on that space. And so I really get what you're saying, that when you're designing these buildings, make space for that community interaction. Speaking of community, you spoke about persuasion, the power of persuasion as a mayor to influence development. I wanted your thoughts on how important is it to involve and engage community in driving some of this development and making it positive and inclusive.
I think it's vitally important. But strong leadership also requires some understanding of what makes a good place and a commitment to do it, because I think involvement of the community is vital. Where I found it quite difficult as mayor is I had a limited time. I knew I had a limited time because I was an independent, and I was the only independent leading a city in the UK, only independent in a senior position in British politics. And that was not sustainable because the political parties have the money, they have the resources, they have the people, they have the information. So the independent, they all hate each other, but they hate an independent even more. So I had limited time. So I was determined that we reduce the domination of the car, for instance. And so I had to use carrot and stick. So yes, some residential communities and parents, and I have to say mothers in particular with children, were very supportive of the restriction that I put on cars and parking in the center of the city and things like that. So that community absolutely were supportive, the schools were supportive, and they were a really important part of the drive to make a better place. But I came up against another part of that community, which were the users of the cars who thought that, hello?
Hello.
I came up against another part of that community, which were the people who drive into work every day and make the city a miserable place for everybody else. And so, yes, go with the community, but it's not, you're never going to please 100% all the time. You'll please some of the people some of the time, and some will hate you. But you've got to be prepared. A leader has got to be prepared to have the courage to push things through, as well as ask people what they want.
We have a ton of audience questions already, and I want to say hello to the community that joins us from around the world. Some of them are friends as well and have been former guests of this program. So hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us on this important conversation on inclusive cities. And we have a few questions on your journey as a politician. And I think, this is an important, point that, and you mentioned this as well, that we've seen delivery of better urban life, quality of life in cities, or things like inclusion in cities by strong mayors and leaders. City level leaders, and your own journey is it's a huge inspiration to a lot of people. You've been a very well-known urbanist and architect, and you made that journey to be a politician. So we have a question, a comment here from Sindhu, who's curious to know about your journey from an architect to a politician. We also have Pedro B. Otis, who used to be the former deputy mayor of Madrid. So again, he had a similar journey from being a technocrat to a politician, and he says if you want to change the world, you have to become a politician. Otherwise, you're just at their service for their own strategies. You must get your hands dirty to improve the world. And you've spoken a ton of times about cities being better places if they had strong leadership structures. And I remember being at this forum, was it in Amsterdam, which was about what would happen if mayors rule the world.
Oh, yes. That's right. Yeah.
And, so talk to us about that, about your own journey, and why it is important to have strong city leaders to deliver some of these agendas on inclusion, on livability.
Yeah. Well, I suppose, incidentally, Madrid is one of my favorite cities. I love Madrid. I was there in March and went on to Portugal. I was traveling by train and then I got stuck in Portugal because I couldn't get back through Spain. So, and then I was desperately trying to get back to the UK, and it broke my principle of flying in Europe because I always try to travel as environmentally responsibly as possible. Anyway, it was wonderful. So Madrid and Lisbon are the last two major cities that I've traveled to before all this lockdown. My journey from being an architect to be a politician, I suppose I felt as an architect that architecture shouldn't just be about the boxes that people build, sometimes funny shaped boxes. It shouldn't just be about the glamour of the architectural magazines. That architects should get their hands dirty in real life and understand what makes a good place to live. And so I'd got involved with making places, not just as an architect, but as a citizen, and making theatres and restaurants and creative industry workplace. And I started seeing the content of the place and the building and the streets as being more important than the shape of the box. And eventually I became president of the Royal Institute of British Architects. And there we started what became the Academy of Urbanism with a great friend of mine, John Thompson, who is sadly desperately ill at the moment. And we saw that architects mustn't work alone. They have to work with the politicians, with the sociologists, with all the people that understand what makes places tick. And so I feel myself to be much more of an urbanist than an architect. And that you get frustrated that the right change doesn't happen as I see it. We've all got our idea what the right change is. But I've lived long enough to learn the good and the bad things. And so out of that frustration, when Britain decided that it would give the opportunities for cities to have elected mayors, and I was the first elected mayor of the city of Bristol, I decided to support that project. And Bristol was one of the very few cities that actually decided to have an elected mayor, and then people said, well, why don't you do it? So that's how I got into that position of politics. But I've avoided party politics, although I was involved in the old Liberal Party many years ago and did get involved locally. So I've in a way, I've always integrated my professional interests with a broader political interest, because what's interesting to me is not the theory, but is getting stuff done and demonstrating what a better world can be. And sometimes when you're in politics, you can do things that you simply can't do otherwise. I think the great thing you can do is say yes to people with good ideas. There's a limit to what you can do yourself, but there are hundreds of people out there with good ideas. Let them happen. Give them the freedom to do things. Give them the freedom to show what will make their community a better one. I say with freedom, I mean that freedom comes with limits, because one person's freedom can be somebody else's restriction. So the politician has got to balance that. But I believe so strongly in demonstrating how things can get better, doing things temporarily, like taking all the traffic out of the city centre for a weekend or whatever it might be. And then people say, oh, that's a good idea. Why don't we do that every weekend? Oh, then why don't we do it all the time? You know, and that process takes a long time, but it doesn't take as long as putting up a building.
And that's a great segue to Camilla's question. So she joins us every session from Tampa, Florida. And in fact, her daughter, her 9-year-old daughter, listens to us as well. So we are influencing young minds. So her question is very specific. This pandemic has made people adapt to new situations. What innovation has surprised you the most?
I don't know. I never used Zoom before. I hadn't heard of Zoom. I think both in terms of family and work and connection, I think what surprised me most is how actually people are in contact with people they probably wouldn't have been without this pandemic, and have got back in touch with people again. I've been absolutely hopeless on social media, except on Twitter. I've used Twitter, not quite like Donald Trump, but I've used Twitter in order to tell people, you know, what I've, you know, exchanged ideas with people and tell people what I was planning to do, but in a gentler, less Trumpian fashion. But I hadn't used much other social media. Now I find that I'm connecting more with people. So to me, that's an innovation. The other innovation is that I think that I talked earlier about bringing the country into the city. In my city, I happen to live in an incredibly pleasant city of Bristol, that a third of the city is open, green or blue space, if you can call water blue space. It's not very blue, but we have a third of the city is open space. What has been absolutely noticeable is the way that nature is thriving in the city during this time. And that may not be what you'd call an innovation. It's not a tech innovation. It's absolutely the opposite, but it's one that people are really appreciating. And I think when we go back, and let's hope we get a vaccine that works and that people accept, when we go back, I think people are going to hang on to a bit of some of those benefits. The birds have got louder. They've got tamer. The traffic noise has subsided. Now, if we get traffic, it must all go electric or hydrogen. You know, it is completely unacceptable to go back to cities that are full of fumes from internal combustion engines. So the innovations are actually about people walking down the middle of the street. They're about those human things that make life so much better. And the innovation to me is actually seeing my family every week because we have a Zoom quiz or conversation in a way that I haven't been seeing every week because we're dispersed. And seeing you again, Pratima, you know, I think the innovations are those little things, but thank God we've got the technology that has made them possible. And the other thing is in trade, I think things are going to change the way we do things. Obviously, we hope that we don't have to socially distance. I look forward to hugging my friends again. You know, it's terrible that there is no physical contact. But I think I've not had one cash transaction in the last 2 months. It's all been card or phone transaction. And so I think cash will get less and less important, and we will get used to a world virtually without cash. I mean, I've been to China where even the beggars have, they ask you to tap their phone for a donation. So I think that's going to become universal.
Yeah, that's the great reset and the nature coming back alive has been a constant theme, and the positive idea out of this COVID-19 pandemic. And we've had multiple of our speakers refer to that. And you're right. I think the digital world has allowed us to stay open during while social distancing. So I think those are two great ideas.
But
We have some.
I look forward to a Zoom where we can shake hands or hug each other.
Yeah,
If somebody
I think
invents that, they will do really well. Yeah.
I was hearing the author of who wrote a book about the history of humanity, and fundamentally our characters are, we thrive with social interaction and engagement. So I think that's not going to go away because
No.
they've kept all of us locked up. And in a city perspective, all of us love the great public spaces of our cities. For a lot of us, the public space is what makes um, a great city. And it's probably been the harshest hit due to this pandemic. We have a question here from Siddhi, who's my colleague, who's asking us about how do you see public spaces in major cities shaping up post the pandemic? Do you think people will start being more will take more precaution as part of their lifestyle as a result of the lockdown, or will these spaces be flooded, inviting much bigger issues in the coming future? And how can government play a role in public realm? And I think you must talk about your strategies for opening up your creative hub in Bristol, which also has huge public realm around it, and you're thinking about opening it up into the streets and parking spaces.
Well, I love opening streets to people. I don't talk about closing streets. I talk about opening them because I always think the streets belong to the people. But how things will change. I think the immediate changes, of course, will come out of the need for more space. Social distancing and social events will require more space. Tables in restaurants and bars and meeting places will be wider apart. I see in Amsterdam there's a restaurant that's put up glass houses along the canal side, so everybody can have their own table and chairs within an enclosed space. So I think there will be more deliberate distancing like that, which is sad because actually, why do we go out? We go out to interact with people. And I think people will become imaginative about how they can interact, and maybe in bars and restaurants, which are a huge part of our economies now. Certainly they are in Europe and in the States. That I think that they will. Of course, they'll hope that things return to normal so that you can get proper interaction between people. But I think that they will grasp more space where they're able to. And as you say, I'm turning some parking space into eating and drinking and socializing space so that you can have the same amount of tables, but you spread them all out. But those big events, I really enjoyed when I was mayor, filling the streets with people and events. And I'm hoping that in 2 or 3 years' time, that will be possible again. But in the meantime, I think we'll all be shouting at each other across bigger spaces. And that's happening in my local park. We all go for, many friends go for walks in the park in the mornings, different times of day. We're now allowed out. We weren't only allowed out 1 hour a day. We're now allowed out more as long as we behave responsibly. And
do you see, George, do you see some repercussions to public space in the medium term as we have to live with this virus? Do you see some tactical interventions in the great public spaces and streets of our cities?
I think it'll be more to do with behavior than physical interventions. I know, in our supermarkets, we've now got screens up by the pay desks, and so that transparent screens, so that which protects the checkout people. And I don't see that happening very much in public space, to be honest. I talked about the Amsterdam restaurant, but I think it's going to be more about common sense and people behaving responsibly. And I think, 99% of people do. There are some idiots. I mean, there are some really stupid people around. There certainly are in this country. But they are an extreme minority who think that this is all a hoax. They listen to all the conspiracy theorists, and they're beginning to rebel a bit. But apart from those who spoil it for others, I think 99% of people will be sensible about it, and we will use public space in a civilized way. Those great public spaces in European cities, apart from them being an event, there are people walking in twos and threes and not bumping into each other too much. So I think people will just be that much more, they've got more used to becoming more careful about not bumping into each other too much. On Indian streets, I think it's going to be extremely difficult, knowing the size of the population, the amount of trading that happens on the street, which I love, but I think that is going to have to massively reduce. But I do hope it's done by consent and not by excessive force. Am I still? Did I break that?
No, you're fine.
You're fine, George. I can hear you.
I do hope that happens by consent and not by excessive force. But where people become stupid, then sometimes they need to be restrained.
Right.
So, currently, when you're looking at any news from India, what's dominating is this migrant population that's returning. They're the laborers who come to work in our cities, and they drive a lot of our infrastructure projects, but also, they do all the essential functions in a way that nobody else wants to do. And right now, they're all returning back to their villages, their hometowns. Some of them are walking hundreds of kilometers because there's no transportation for them, etc. And there are two questions out here which are kind of linked about urbanization of rural India, to control migration to cities. There's a lot of discussion about should we invest in providing jobs at source, or should we, make sure that there's equal development. And it's a hard thing, but, I think the time has come to really address it because, like Thomas says, that Gandhiji saw urban as vacating the houses of rural, and this dialogue has brought us to where we are today. Do you think the time has come to go back to nature? But it's not really about going back to nature. It's about equal development. And how do you do that? How can, and you were mayor of Bristol, and I'm sure, because on one of my study trips, I went to Glasgow, and after the shipbuilding industry went through a downturn, a lot of people lost their jobs, and that city actually saw a decline. So how do you maintain, the economy, bring in fresh ideas, innovation, development, incentivize that city to have more jobs and attract more investment?
Well, I think migrant working is a big issue across the world. It's not so much. It's less of an issue maybe in the UK than it is in Europe than it is in some other parts of the world. I absolutely see it's a very big issue in India. It's a massive issue in China, where the villages and small towns have been decimated by migrant working. So the migrant workers leave their families stranded in these poor villages and live in barrack-like conditions, in terrible conditions in the city. They're not proper citizens, are not considered as proper citizens. They are second-class citizens, and I think that we do need to have a very serious look at that whole system of migrant working. And what would be much healthier is if we have self-sustaining places, whether they're villages, towns, or cities, that don't don't exploit people who are not part of that system. If you're working in the city, you should be a full citizen of that city. You should get all the privileges of that city, of being a citizen. And migrant working depends on us looking down on them. And I think that is really unhealthy. So I think the only answer to it is to invest in communities, whether they're villages, towns, or cities, to make them much more self-sustaining. And I think that will improve the general economy, both the national and the global economy. And at the other end of that is the small farmers in the villages who are being exploited by the big global corporations who really destroyed that great connection that they have with their local communities by buying up their crops instead of allowing them to have proper mixed farming that supplies what's needed locally. So we have broken down what was a natural system and become I think we have now a very unnatural economy. And we need to look at every way of returning to a much more natural economy that doesn't rely on tearing people out of their communities.
George, I want to press you a little bit further on this conversation of urban versus rural. And, it's come to the forefront today because of the migrant workers crisis that most Indian cities are facing, right? So we've had, as you know, pull migration over the last 2 to 3 decades because there was not much livelihood options in India's villages, right? So we had subsistence farming. So I remember an expert a few years ago telling me that, someone who was an adult in 1950, probably has 3 generations ahead of him now, grandsons and great-grandsons. So, in that small farm community, you kind of have to take care of a really large family because, someone who was a 20-year-old in 1950 probably has great-grandkids who are teenagers now who have to look for jobs. And that's the reason that we are seeing migration into cities. And a crisis like this puts a huge, stress on that question of urban and rural. And our founding father, Mahatma Gandhi, as you know, always spoke about India living in its villages, and a lot of urban policy followed that. And in some ways, in a negative way, we never invested in urban infrastructure to allow for livable spaces for everybody in our cities because of that. So, I would like you to talk to us about the whole debate about urban versus rural, because if you had access to services and lifestyle in urban areas, we should not mistake suburbia for urban sprawl for rural economy. I think that distinction is very, very important at this point in time, or we'll lose the opportunity of this crisis to move towards a more sustainable model of development. If we had the same human development index in a village versus a city, in some ways a city dweller would consume lower per capita resources because we share it among various people within our communities. So it's impossible for all for the state to deliver that level of service and infrastructure in a tiny rural area of India. So I think it's important to make that distinction between between rural and urban, and link it to this bigger conversation of urbanization.
Yes, I think it comes down to how we measure success, doesn't it? I think we're now, one of the great things I think that is coming out of this current crisis is people questioning the value of gross domestic product, of GDP, because nations and cities have judged their success by GDP. And that actually has been one of the great drivers that has created things like migrant workers, because it's all about pushing the economy, pushing industrialization, pushing commercialization. And we should measure success in terms of quality of life. And I think it's a more difficult thing. I mean, GDP measures all the dreadful things in life as well. Every time somebody has a car accident, it adds to the GDP. Every time somebody buys drugs or gets ill, or all adds to the GDP. So it's a really, really dangerous measure. So I think we sort of need to start again at measuring in terms of a different sort of economics, what my friend Helena Norbert Hodge calls the economics of happiness. And that all sounds a little bit hippie and Buddhist, but it is, I think, it's right to all of us that, what do we value most in life? It's not every last pound. It's not watching the stock market. What we value in life are all those things that make life bearable, that the little comforts, the connection with nature, as we've talked about. And I think that it's this extreme emphasis on global business and people trying to outdo each other in terms of how many billions of dollars they've got, and I think is creating this artificial drive for an economy that is not really benefiting the majority of the people who are taking part in that economy. So, I do think this is a time for reflection. And one of the greatest things that can come out of it is looking at how we serve ourselves in a better way. And then, for instance, I'll go back to farming, because farming is the food production is so vitally important. Actually, people working on small farms and small landholding are more efficient than this great industrialized farming that we've been sold. It's not an efficient way of producing things. There's a huge amount of waste. So I'll tell you one thing. I used to really admire India for the way it dealt with waste. It would reuse everything. And sometimes that came out of poverty, in that you would reuse every water bottle, you would reuse every water bottle top, you would reuse every Coca-Cola can, everything would get reused. Now we waste so much, and we should just get rid of the idea of waste and see that everything that comes out of what we do should become a resource for something else. So creating circular economies are, I think, fundamental to both the individual happiness, but also to communities working as proper communities, whether they're rural or urban communities. Thomas, you're also, we've separated industrialization from urbanization. So what Pratimras may be possible thanks to technology by lifting some consumption styles to small and medium towns and keep urban, rural hinterland closer to nature. Yeah, I totally agree. I think I see that more as a statement than a question, but I think you're absolutely right.
But I get your point about, looking at success from the point of view as human development index versus just pure GDP growth. But, we don't want a situation where we, urbanize large parts of India, through urban sprawl because of this crisis. I think that would be the wrong way to go. We have to preserve our bioproductive land and contain urbanization and enable good quality of life in rural India. And I would hope that this crisis will push our cities to ensure that decent quality of life is available for the informal workers and the migrant community in our cities. And I think that would be a great outcome, because I think the fault lines are very visible, and I hope Indian politicians
you're not
think
really
about this.
rich. You're not really rich in a proper sense by just having a lot of money. You're not rich if, in effect, you're locked into your own castle in the city. And when you step out of it, there is poverty all around you. You're rich when you live in a thriving community where there is mutual respect by people across that community. And so I despair of people who think that they can buy success in terms of building themselves this isolated castle in the city. That is not real success. Real success is bringing the community with you as part of your life, I think, whichever part you play in that community. And we're now all, to a certain extent, isolated, but that isolation will continue if we don't deal with some of those fundamental social issues. As you know, in some parts of the world, that's more extreme than in others. But
And that really brings...
it's very sad in my own city. I say I live in a relatively rich country. It'll be a lot poorer now, but I live in a relatively rich country with some people who are, some very well off, some middle class people who live in great comfort. But it's uncomfortable that there are still so many people in dire poverty living on the streets, begging, and with poor mental health. I think if we put both what I talked about well-being, but I think if we put health at the top of our agenda, it helps deal with the whole environmental issues as well, because clean air is absolutely vital to people's health. This pandemic is hitting the people who have bad respiratory problems, and a lot of those bad respiratory problems come out of poor urban conditions. It's hitting people with it's hitting people with other illnesses that are environmental illnesses. And so if you put health at the top, I think it will help deal with the big environmental questions, because the biggest thing we're faced with globally is the crisis of climate change. And it's the first moment I've talked about climate change, but actually in my life, that is, I regard as the biggest threat. That is where I feel guilty when I talk to my children and my grandchildren that we didn't do more to deal with what has now become a real danger in the not too distant future, and is already affecting weather patterns. It's great to see that many people now are seeing that we can run our lives on renewables rather than on carbon fuels. I think we will be, partly because of the invention of the means for us to communicate with each other, which I think will get better and better. We'll probably fly less, and rightfully so. We shouldn't be subsidizing the carbon industries like we do, because we will be healthier and happier if we have a better, if the world is a healthy world. And so I'm hoping out of this pandemic we get a much, much greater environmental responsibility across governments and across industry.
Well, on that note, thank you, George, for sharing your thoughts with us, because it's really during this great reset that we can reflect on what kind of a world and what kind of a city that we really want to live in, and how do we treat people around us, and how can we get more involved, whether we are citizens or architects or urbanists or whoever. We have a voice. We live in a democracy, and we should use our voice. And one of the reasons why we started this inclusive city series was to help people think through these complex issues and get voices and perspectives that are different, so that it provokes us into really demanding accountability, so that once this is over, we don't go back to business as usual, but we kind of, force our governments to make that change, to rethink who has the right to the city and how can we actually get the cities that we need. Thank you so much.
And in answer to one last question is, politicians have to make themselves more accessible, because I think a lot of people simply cannot get in touch with the politicians who ask for their vote at election time, but don't really communicate at other times.
On that note, thank you, George. It was so nice to see you. And thanks to all the audience that joins us. Stay safe and stay well during this pandemic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a
Lovely to
great
see you.